Augustine asked me to kind of talk about this field in particular. He's been doing some measurements for a couple years with some of the practices I've been doing. And this particular field, I'm also working with General Mills, and they've hired Understanding Ag, and they kind of work a lot with soil health. And they don't necessarily tell me what to do, but they have ideas, which a lot of things you never think of, and just different ways to look at your operation. And I guess to start off with, in any field, it's like everybody should take a soil percolation test of the ground and just see how water infiltrates. Because, a lot of people get an inch of rain and they say, oh man, that was great. And they get 2 inches of rain and say, oh, that was better than 1 inch. And then they get a 3 inch, well, that was absolutely great. Well, they don't realize that generally, once your soil is saturated or just wet, that most tilled ground and a lot of no-till ground, only the first half inch will really infiltrate, and it usually takes about an hour. Everything after that is just wasted. So it's like driving across the road and thinking, wow, we're making all that moisture, and it's like, well, no, you're not, because every time it rains, there's a pond sits down at the east end, and it just runs down there, or it runs down the ditch. This particular road, it hasn't been maintained in probably almost 2 years, because the guy who, every time it would rain, the water would just run over the road so bad and create washes. He said, screw it, but it's just interesting to watch how people have misconceptions about their ground, and from what they think is happening to what is actually happening. So I would highly recommend everybody do that at least on one field, just so you know what's going on. The other thing is a total nutrient sample. And that's where just pull soil cores and send them into a lab, and they tell you everything that is out there. And it's really eye-opening, because with like a lot of fertilizers, we just think, want anything to grow, we've got to add fertilizers. Well, like this field here, and this was pulled 2 years ago, but there's over 3,200 pounds of nitrogen out here per acre. It's out there, but it's not available. Like it would take quite a while for me to use 3,200 pounds of nitrogen. And then the phosphorus, there's 1,600 pounds of phosphorus, but none of it's available. And here, with the way fertilizer prices are, we keep hauling out more and just adding to that, and it's not, we can't utilize it. And then with nitrogen, like this milo, because I applied 80 units of nitrogen in the spring, because it's a process to convert from relying on synthetic fertilizers to trying to work with nature. It's kind of a process. But of those 80 pounds, I figure the crop probably is utilizing about, if I'm lucky, 35 pounds. Maybe closer to 25. Just because, it's been proven that you have about a 10 to 30% efficiency rate on nitrogen. So, that's kind of disheartening with the way nitrogen prices are going. So, that's kind of the couple of the big picture items. Not to mention, above every acre out here, there is 34,000 tons of nitrogen in the air that we can't utilize if our plants aren't working right. So that's there every day. We just can't use that. And And then a healthy soil can have 2,000 pounds of organisms in the soil. So if you think about that, there's 91 acres here. I could have a 1,200 pound cow with an 800 pound calf on every acre. So when you think about managing for soil health, it's as important to think about the organisms that are under the soil versus instead of solely what's on top of the soil. So that's kind of the big picture thing, the things that I think about. But just as important is, it's like, okay, so how do I utilize that stuff without going broke and still trying to farm to raise a crop? So kind of this particular field has had something growing on it for a little over 2 years. In the spring 2 years ago, it was in soybeans. We cut the soybeans. We went to wheat, live root. After the wheat was harvested in 2020, then I went in and planted a warm season cover crop. And that warm season cover crop, I let it go till the middle of August last year. I sprayed and terminated it. I didn't graze it, I just let it grow, just because I was trying to keep the microbes in the soil alive, and they needed something to eat. After I terminated that cover crop, I came in with triticale, planted a triticale blend. I think that was rape, radishes, buckwheat, and there might have been one or two other things, but those were the main ones. And then it was on New Year's Day last year, I brought in some, they were basically 500 pound stalkers. I brought 120 of them in, and I had a perimeter fence all the way around this. And what I did was start up on the west end, and every day I gave them about the equivalent of 2 acres. This 91 acres lasted just a little bit over a month. So I had a fence that went straight north and south. Basically what I would do every morning was just come and move my fence over, and they would just walk with me. And as long as because I didn't dilly-dally and I came and saw them by 8 or 8:30, they were fine. If I didn't come early in the morning and they knew they were going to move, sometimes they would try to move before me once in a while, because they knew the routine. But I did that every day, and it took me about, to move my fence, walk down to the river and back, was about 15 or 20 minutes. It depended on how much observing I did on the way back, and kind of watched what they were doing. And every day when I'd walk back, that'd give me a chance to look at manure, see how they're doing, look at eyes, just look at their general health, see how much, if they're overgrazing, undergrazing. Because when I was with the livestock, with the animals, I was shooting for about a pound of gain a day. And I've done it a couple of years. A couple of years ago, they were on an actual, we weigh tested them, checked them in and out every animal, and we got about a pound. Last summer, I just did a check weight with about a third of the herd, and we still kind of averaged about the same. Getting about a pound a day, and really all they had to eat was, they had this triticale was grazing, and they had some dry matter, just some cheap feedstuffs that were basically left over, where if they wanted some picking, they could go eat that. But when I was grazing, I always wanted to leave the ground covered. I never wanted to see dirt. That got a little hard. We did have some days where it was raining when we were out here, and generally, when it was raining, only the paddock that they were in when it was raining got chewed up. So there might be a strip that was, 40 feet wide down the length of the field that I could tell it got a little chewed up. But in generally, it wasn't too bad. Now, I guess I did forget to add, as I moved them down, as we went to the east, once a week, I would put up a back fence so that they could not go back and loaf in that area.
And your water source was where?
The water source is clear up in that corner.
Okay.
So I kind of had a funnel, basically. There was a little bit of ground had to be sacrificed.
Right.
So, but that's where they went to water.
So is that a well?
No, it's Mule Creek.
Okay.
It was fine until we were here when the February cold hit. We had about 3 days of grazing, and as cold as it was, they were fine grazing, even though those triticale plants are shriveled up and there's almost, I mean, it just doesn't look like it'd be anything that'd be interesting. They would still be out there. They were on that far corner, and they were fine because I wanted them to have something extra when I got to that point. So I did give them some alfalfa. And they didn't even eat it. They would much rather be out here grazing. And then when we finally left, then we just went back across the creek. After that, I let the cover crop regrow, and then this spring I kind of had some problems because when my regrowth was coming, I had a serious amount of cheat that just made me nervous when it started to head out, because I did not want it all going to seed. So I sprayed, and basically all that did was make it mad because it did not kill very well. So I did have after things did kind of kick up and start, as the temperature warmed up, I did have to spray it again. And chemical use in a situation where you're trying to focus on soil health, spraying chemical really isn't any different than disking. You try to limit it. You know, it's a necessary tool, but you try to limit it. So, but then I think I started to try to terminate this in late April. I did not get the milo planted until I believe it was like June 12th, just because we weren't really wet, but we were too damp to plant type of situation. And my double disc, I drill everything, and my double disc drill, just conditions were not right, so I just had to wait it out. But this was planted June the 12th. And this is a full season variety. It was the first milo I planted, and it'll probably be the last that I cut. It's been trying to head out, I think, for 2.5 weeks. Just slow. But for right now, anyway, it doesn't look bad. The monitor you see over there is a Understanding Ag installed that, and it's a moisture probe. It goes down 48 inches, and so when it rains, I can see the moisture percolating down in the soil.
Too bad they didn't put one over there too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, then you could really see the difference as far as infiltration.
Yeah. If I left anything out, Augustine?
Oh, that's good. Thank you for the illustration.
If you guys have any questions, you can answer now, or I'll be around until it gets too hot.
So, any problems that you see in this field with regard to grazing?
No, my biggest problem was the cheat. And after talking with David from Understanding Ag, of course he's been around the block a lot more than I have. He said he would have just let it go. He would have managed for the biomass for the cover, because one of the things I really like about triticale is that if you get nice growth on that triticale, when it dies, it's allelopathic to pigweeds, and I have seen that a lot. So,
what's your plan after the milo? Are you going to try to get a fall cover crop in this fall?
No, because as dry as we've been this summer, I need to graze this.
Okay,
Because
so
I figure this
you're
milo is probably going to be the 1st of November before I can cut it, most likely.
So you're gonna graze the stalk.
Yeah,
off
so
of
I'm
it.
going to try to bring cows in, graze it, and then as soon as the cows leave, then I will plant it. But if things would change and I would not need the grazing, I might go ahead and just plant it and then graze it.
Right.
So, but it's going to have a cover. What?
Planted to what?
It'll be triticale and maybe a little bit of vetch, but mainly triticale, because next year's crop is going to be soybeans.
Okay.
So I don't want to have a lot of legumes ahead of soybeans.
Right.
So, but I do want the triticale.
How late would you go with the triticale if you were to plant it? I mean, from the standpoint of
There's no time. If I can't get in till March 15th, I'd probably still plant it.
even if you're still gonna plant beans behind
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I want something in there because I need the soybeans are kind of hard on the soil, on the ground. They seem like I have a hard enough time trying to get organic matter, and soybeans don't help that situation.
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Brad.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing, looking at cover crop management for dryland systems. So I have a little bit of handouts going around. If you can grab one, that will be my just be focused on that. Sharing some of the data that we've been collecting from Brad's field here and also from our own research down in far western part of the state, which is more drier than here. He's been getting more moisture than usual, but maybe not this year. Yeah. So on the first page, I have a couple of pie charts that shows how we are looking at integrating cover crops into dryland cropping systems. So we do have in western Kansas, most of our base crop production systems will be a winter wheat sorghum fallow. So if you look at the first pie chart, we have 2 fallow periods. So we have a fallow after wheat, between wheat and grain sorghum planting, and we also have another fallow period after grain sorghum harvest before we plant the next winter wheat crop. So in our research, we are looking at how we can replace portions of this fallow period with a cover crop. So if we plant a cover crop, either we can plant a cover crop after wheat harvest, which will be a summer cover crop, or we can plant a cover crop after sorghum harvest, mostly in the spring. So we are looking at spring planted cover crops and then also summer planted cover crops. Then we also have situations where you have a very intensified cropping system like what Brad has ongoing here, where he can plant winter wheat followed by another winter wheat. Then he has a cover crop in there and then he plant soybeans. So that was the system that he was operating. I think he has a flexible crop rotation. So now he has sorghum here after his cover crops. So this, ideally in every situation where you have a fallow period, you can put in a cover crop. And we know some of the advantages of having cover crop in our system. Cover crops provide soil protection. You have something growing, it can protect the soil from wind erosion and also water. So like if you look at the other side where we have a fallow ground that has been tilled, like Brad mentioned, if you have rainfall, the soil, most of our soil has a fixed capacity to store water. So after all the holes are filled, you see the water standing on the soil surface. After a couple of days, all the water will evaporate. Sometimes you think that it may be infiltrating in the soil. It's not. Most of it is evaporation. So you see you are going to lose the soil. But if you have a ground that is no-till, it's a more intensified system. When it rains, you are going to have the water percolating into the soil, and that is what you want. And if you look at our system or our environment, we get most of our rainfall in May, June, July. And that time is also very hot. So you have all this high humidity and higher temperatures. You get the rain, instead of it penetrating into the soil, if you have a system where the infiltration is low, you are going to lose everything within 3 days. We saw that in this year. It was so wet in May, towards the end of May, for us to plant. We waited for about a week, and then it was too dry to plant milo in June. So it was very strange, but that is kind of one of the things that we've been dealing with in dryland environments. When it's you get a rainfall, it's so dry, so hot and windy, and you lose all the water through evaporation. So if you have a soil that can increase infiltration, then you have some of the water stored in the subsoil. So if you can get your crop up, then during July and August, when you are not getting any rainfall, then your milo is going to depend on the subsurface moisture. And we've seen this in our own research, where you have a conventional till field versus a no-till field. When you begin to see water stress in the conventional till for 2 weeks ahead of the no-till field. And here they didn't have, we drove around here, you can see some milo fields that are even showing water stress. And here this milo looks really, really nice. And because of the no-till system with a lot of residue, have very good infiltration here, so we have subsoil moisture for the milo to depend on it. So these are some of the importance of cover crops. And we are working with Brad here, looking at some of the cover crop production fields that he has. We took soil samples from here. We are also monitoring the biomass before he grazed the cover crops, and then after he terminates the cover crops. So we took measurements from here and another field about 3 miles,
just a mile straight south
from here. We collected data from here in 2018. Then we took data from that field in 2020. And if you look at the second page of your handout, that is on the first figure that I have, is the biomass cover crop productivity from this field. So in 2019, we collected the blue line will be triticale rapeseed and radishes. That is before he grazed the cover crops. And then the red bar will be post grazing, and then the gray bar will be the ungrazed cover crop. And as you can see, the first 2 bars are almost the same, so statistically they are not different in 2019. So before he grazed the cover crop, and then the biomass that is left following the cover crop were the same. There were no differences, even though they were less than the ungrazed cover crop treatment. And then in 2020, that we saw a significant regrowth. You see the post-grazed cover crop biomass was about 1,000 pounds per acre, more than when he started grazing the cover crop. So this is very good, and it was even similar to the ungrazed cover crop biomass. So this tells you that he's doing a good job in managing for soil health. So the goal,
I asked a question, Brett, on the grazing part, with these differences, because you're actually ending up with more biomass than you started. Was that a daily move?
yeah
Okay, okay.
yeah, so when he moves the cattle, there's regrowth occurring at the other, where he finished grazing. And then after he take the cattle out, you leave a couple of about a month or 2 before you terminate, right? Yeah, so that month period after the grazing gives the cover crop chance to regrow, and this is mostly triticale. So at the end of grazing, we have more of triticale than the other. The only cover crop that survived was the rapeseed. You have some rapeseed in the cover crop mix, but it was mostly triticale, winter triticale. So they have significant regrowth potential. So if you 2019 when I took some pictures here, it's very, very nice. I showed those in my presentations. We have a very nice cover crop residue. So if you have that kind of protection following grazing, then you are not losing anything from the cover crop, because you graze the cover crop, you have very good regrowth, and you have significant soil cover. So we don't expect any negative impact of grazing the cover crop. So this is where you are managing for soil health.
Yeah. I have another question, Augustine. There were other studies in this program, is that correct?
Yes.
Did they do daily moves on the grazing part?
Not everybody does
Okay.
that. It's a lot of significant work. We have another producer field in Alexander. So there he divides the field into 4 blocks. So he just grazed each block. So after grazing the block, he moved the cow to the next block, and then so we have 4 blocks. And then what we found out was these were spring planted cover crops. June, the triticale and oat, they grow very quickly. So they started heading, and then at that time the cattle doesn't like to eat the head, so the digestibility decreases. So that is kind of a little bit of a problem. So you may want to start grazing it earlier so you don't get into that kind of high rapid growth phase. So when it begins to warm up, then it starts heading and it grows very, very quickly. So you have to move, maybe you have to increase the stocking rate so you can graze everything that you want to graze. So the other thing that I want to also share with you is, even though you can grade these cover crops, in our environment the productivity is highly variable. So the next graph is data from our cover crops that we have research at near Brownell. So we've been collecting data from 2015 to 2019. So we have 5 different cover crop species or mixes that we are looking at. We have oat alone, triticale cover crop, oat triticale pea, and then a cocktail mixture. And we are seeing that the grass cover crops, most of our productivity is dominated by the grass cover crops. When we have mixtures, we can have peas, other buckwheat, radishes, and then peas in the mixture. When we reduce the grass species in the mix, the productivity tends to be less. Most of it is dominated by the oat and triticale in the mix. So that is something that you have to look at if you are interested in producing more biomass for grazing. Then you have to have some grass species in the mix so you can have the biomass that you really want. And also the product, I don't have that graph here, but our average yields ranges from about 3,000 pounds per acre from 2015, 2016, and then 2017. And 2019 and 2020 we had about 1,500 pounds per acre. The yields are highly variable. In some years we get very good productivity, in other years the yields are lower, and it all depends on the moisture conditions in the spring and then the temperature. In 2019 it was dry. We planted the cover crops, it didn't come up. And in 2020 I think it was too wet for us to plant. We planted the cover crops late and we didn't get that much production from the cover crops. So the weather plays very significant role in this grazing of cover crops. So you have to have a flexible management strategy where you grow the cover crop, you don't get that much production. If you are managing for soil health, then it's better not to graze the cover crop at all, then leave the residue to protect the soil. So you have to have some kind of flexibility in how you manage this for grazing. Then we are looking at soil health parameters. One of the challenges of grazing cover crops in crop production fields is the potential for soil compaction. So some producers are skeptical of grazing cover crops because you can cause some compaction issues. So we collected data from grass fields out here. We have an area where he did not graze in 2019. Then I believe this year too, we collected data from these fields, and that will be your figure 4 on page 3. We collected samples from 0 to 2 inches, 2 to 4 inches, and 4 to 6 inches to look at soil bulk density, which is a measure of soil compaction. So here you can see we have the blue bars again are the graze plus, the red bars are the ungrazed plus, and then the gray bar is critically alone that was not grazed. At each of the depth that we measured, we did not see any differences in bulk density between where we grazed the cover crops and where we did not graze the cover crops. We saw the same thing also in 2020. That will be the next graph, figure 5. So here we actually did collect some data. We were curious about, he has a water tank on part of the field where the cattle were congregated. So most of the time it's kind of a sacrifice area, and then he goes in and till it. So I was curious to look at, because you can see the cattle hoof mark, the density is very intense around the water tank area. So I just took samples there to see if there's some compaction in that area too. So those will be the next figure, figure 5. The blue bar is a pasture, so there was a decent pasture there. So we just took samples there just for comparison. And then we have the red bar, which will be the critically cover crop that was grazed. Then the gray bar is the plot that was in grazed. And then the yellow bar will be where the samples that were collected near the water tank. You can see from here that the pasture has very low bulk density compared to the crop field. But we did not see any difference in the shallow depth, 0 to 2 inches, between the grazed and then the non-grazed cover crops, and even near the water tank. However, 2 to 4 inches, we saw a significant difference between the tank near the areas near the water tank, and then the grazed and then the ungrazed cover crops. So there was a little bit of compaction, but we did not detect that in the top 2 inches. We detected that in the 2 to 4 inches. But we knew that going into that to see whether we are having some compaction around the watering area. But here too, the big picture is we did not see any significant differences between the grazed cover crops and where we did not graze the cover crop in terms of soil compaction. So I think he is doing a very good job in managing the fields with integrating grazing into the crop production field with the cover crops. We are not seeing any negative effect on bulk density. Then we also look at aggregate stability, which is a measure of soil structure. So this one, figure 6 and figure 7, they are a measure of water stable aggregate. So this is kind of an indicator to look at how these soils can hold up in terms of water erosion. So the bigger the value, the more developed the soil structure, and it will be more resistant to water erosion. So here, if you look at figure 6, the pasture that has living roots year round has very high aggregate stability. That's 3.5 millimeters. So that's very, very good structure compared to the crop field. But we did not see, even there, we did not see in terms of mean weight diameter of water stable aggregate, there's no difference between the grazed than the non-grazed cover crops. So we are not seeing any negative impact on grazing cover crops in terms of soil structure. Then the second figure, that figure 7, is from a cover crop field that we have near Hayes. This is another producer field that we are working with a producer in Hayes, looking at grazing cover crops. These are summer cover crops. So here too we have a grazed cover crop and a non-grazed cover crop. statistically we are not seeing any negative effect of grazing cover crop on water stable aggregates. So this is a good practice. If you manage it very well, you can improve your soil structure without any negative effect with grazing of these cover crops. I think the next figures will be crop residue from grazing cover crops, and this is from our own research at HB Ranch. So in our own research, we are looking at comparing wheat sorghum fallow with a wheat sorghum cover crops planted in the spring, where we are grazing the cover crops, or we are leaving the cover crops non-grazed, or we hay the cover crops. So in the first figure, figure 8, we are looking at crop residue at the time of winter wheat planting. We having about 85 to 90% of crop residue cover even with grazing of these cover crops compared to fallow. So we have significant soil cover with the cover crop treatments, whether we graze it, we hay it, compared to the wheat sorghum fallow no-till. So these cover crops, if managed properly, you can have significant residue cover compared to a no-till fallow situation. And I think this is the reason why we are not seeing any negative effect of grazing cover crop or haying, even haying cover crop on soil properties compared to fallow. Then figure 7 is, sorry, that should have been figure 9, is soil organic carbon data that we collected from this particular field, where we have grazed cover crops and then non-grazed cover crops at 2 inches and 2 to 6 inches. And this is wrong. This is not this field. That is the field in 2020 that we sample about 1 mile east from here, south of here. And we did not see here too, we did not see any difference in terms of soil organic matter between the grazed cover crops and then where we did not graze the cover crops. So grazing the cover crop did not have any negative effect on soil organic carbon versus where we did not graze the cover crop. And this is because we are leaving adequate residue cover on the soil surface. If we are not doing that and we are overgrazing the cover crops, there's high possibility that we will have negative impact on soil organic carbon content versus where we did not graze. I think I have one last page looking at this kind of the same. We are seeing the same results in our own studies at HB Ranch, where we are looking at water stable aggregates in grazed versus non-grazed cover crops, and then the fallow treatments. So we are seeing whether we have the cover crop figure, the last page. You see we have fallow treatments, no-till fallow, we have standing cover crops, hayed cover crops, and grazed cover crops. And we actually saw a significant increase in water stable aggregates where we have cover crops, whether we graze the cover crops or we hay the cover crops versus no-till fallow. So this is a very good practice. So far, we have been doing this for 6 years and we are not seeing any negative effect. So, but we are looking at removing 40% of the cover crop biomass. So if you go in and you graze about 70-80% of the cover crop biomass and you don't have any regrowth, then the results will be different. So we are looking at managing this in terms of protecting the soil and also getting an economic value from the cover crop. So that is what we are doing. But if you manage it differently, the results could be different. So far, we are not seeing any negative effects of grazing cover crops on soil health if you don't take too much biomass, too much of the cover crop biomass, and if you have some regrowth from the cover crop to protect the soil. So that is what I have. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those.
On the cover crops at Brownell, those are all the ones that are associated with the chart. That was all spring planted, right?
Yeah, those are all spring planted cover
spring
crops.
planted,
Yeah.
and then your measurements from the standpoint of residue cover and biomass and stuff was probably, I'm guessing, done just prior to termination then?
Yeah, so those we measure those in June.
Okay.
So we plant the cover crops in March, and then we take the biomass measurements in June, and we go ahead and terminate the cover crops.
Right.
Our target was around the first week in June, but sometimes, depending on the weather, we terminating the cover crop around June 16th. But the plan was to terminate it in the first week in June. The goal is to have, when the cover crop begins to head out, that is where you have maximum productivity. So, and then at that point too, if you are using it for forage, the forage quality is very high. I didn't give data on forage quality, but we are measuring about some of the on-farm stuff at Brass, and then at Alexander, we are getting about 20% crude protein. And then in our own research, where the cover crop has been headed, we're getting about 12% crude protein. So that is very high forage quality. So we terminate our cover crops at heading. But in production fields, they actually start grazing the cover crop a little bit earlier. Any other questions?
On figure 8, it's the one that's dealing with the percent ground cover.
Mm-hmm.
How did you hay a cover crop and still maintain such a high ground cover?
Yes, the question is, how do I hay cover crops and still have a high percent ground cover? I didn't mention that. We are harvesting our cover crops at 6 inches tall. So we go ahead and cut it at 6 inches, so we leave more stubble on the soil surface. So if you cut it about 2 or 3 inches, you wouldn't have that percent cover.
Okay.
So I should have made that clear. We are intentionally cutting it at 6 inches, so we have enough cover.
And then you're getting some regrowth after that.
Yeah,
just like you would grazing.
if you leave it, it will regrow. But we cut it and just turn around and terminate
Terminate it, and you still have that.
and we still have that much cover. If in production field, if you can allow it to you can have some regrowth, but we just go turn around and terminate it, and we still have that much soil cover out there. Any other question?
You were talking about nitrogen earlier and the cost, how it was expensive. Are you doing any tests on as far as how much nitrogen you're using up with these cover crops, or are you gaining more nitrogen, or as far as that?
Yeah, the question is, are we nitrogen is very expensive. Are we getting a lot of nitrogen uptake from the cover crops? Yeah, we're taking up nitrogen with our cover crops. When we do soil analysis following termination of the cover crops, our fallow plots actually had more nitrogen than where we had the cover crop. That's true. We're taking up some nitrogen from the soil, but it's not that significantly different from our fallow field. But the fallow field has more nitrogen than the cover crop field. So that is why it's important that you get some economic value from your cover crop. Because if you are growing it strictly as a cover crop, one thing that we are seeing with not our spring cover crop, we also have a summer cover crop that we plant after wheat harvest, and then the following year we plant sorghum to the cover crop stubble. We see significant nitrogen deficiency in our sorghum, even though we are applying about 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Where we had as fallow looks completely different. It's just night and day where we had the cover crop. Because of the residue, you take up this is forage sorghum mostly, and it takes out nitrogen, it ties up in the residue. And you have more residue there, which is tying up the nitrogen. After a couple of years, we may build up the organic matter content, and if we get very good, if it's not too dry, if the conditions are right, we can get nitrogen mineralization to give us some nitrogen to the crop to kind of balance the nitrogen from what we took from the soil to produce the cover crop. But the initial stages of doing this, you are going to get nitrogen immobilization from the cover crops. So yeah, cover crop, they do take nitrogen.
If you're in that scenario where you had like a sedan grass as your cover crop,
Yep.
and then you went to milo, would you not be better if you did a lot of broadleaves and legumes?
Yeah, we have broadleaves in there. We have so the mixture was Sudan grass, sunham, cowpea. Cowpea, we are planting about 20 pounds of the cowpea, and then we have radishes, we have rapeseed. But it turns out to be dominated by the Sudan grass and then the sunham. And the first years that we did this, we had about almost 8,000 pounds per acre. So you have so much residue. So, and Joe will attest to that. You plant through it and just dragging the residue through the field. And if you have that kind of scenario, it's just going to tie up the nitrogen. But the question about the raw leaves, the only legume that we've been able to plant in our research is does well is sunham. All others does not do very well in Nigeria. They will grow and then they don't grow that well, and the seed is very expensive. It's a very expensive seed. So if you are interested in nitrogen, I'll just buy fertilizer that $3 a pound of the legume seed. That's the way to grow that well. Any other question? Okay, I've done a lot of more talking. So, I'll let Stacy talk a little bit about cover crops and water quality, how you can use cover crops to improve soil water quality.
Reservoir. So my name is Stacy Minson and I'm Kansas State University watershed specialist. My office is in Waukegan, so I'm on the west end of the watershed. The watershed drains 2,400 square miles into Canopolis. It covers a portion of 10 counties. So when we look at how we're going to protect Canopolis, it takes everybody living in the watershed. And I wish I was a magic genie and had unlimited amount of cost share for producers to do some of the things like Brad is doing. And because of where Brad lives, Brad's actually not eligible for any cost share in my watershed because he's below the reservoir, obviously. So my job is to work with producers and city county governments to look at water quality issues. You guys know what the biggest pollutant is in Canopolis? It's sediment's what it is. And then what's the next one?
Phosphorus?
It's nutrients. So nitrogen and phos specifically. Many of you here know that this was the oldest reservoir. It is the oldest reservoir built in the state, and it is a federal water supply. So that's one of the challenges for me, is because everything that's coming downstream affects what somebody's water supply looks like coming back out of a faucet or a hydrant. So the things that I work on are water quality, obviously. The four biggest pollutants that we deal with are nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, and E. coli bacteria. So the benefits of cover crops, when we're looking at it, the biggest benefit of cover crop is the soil erosion and improving that. If we have a living root more days out of the year and some type of cover crop here, even if it's a residue, we can improve water quality issues. So when we get this heavy rain, when Brad was mentioning earlier, when it rains over on this field to the south of us that's conventional, we know that water's moving. If if that water is hitting in this, it's got lots of things that it can hit. The example I use with kids to look at a no-till situation and a conventional till that they can kind of understand, and even adults. If you look at Augustine's head, he's going to be our conventional till, okay? When that water hits his head, it's rolling off. I don't have long hair, but I've got longer hair than most of you here. When it hits mine, it's got to grab something, so I've got the cover. Now, it seems silly, but kids and adults will remember no-till and conventional till in that scenario much more than just talking and saying what it is. They'll understand that they've got cover. And over the years, I've had a few parents come up to me and say, my kid's really concerned that they have water running off of their head in a rain event. So it tells me that they learned something. They got the message with it. For us, when we look at the benefits here, Brad, what's your biggest benefit that cover crops has brought to the operation?
Reduction in synthetic inputs, namely herbicides would be the first.
Okay, so he's reducing herbicides, and I do have to commend him for saying that sometimes when we're putting chemicals out here, we're maybe not doing exactly what we want. There's a give and take, and in some instances with cover crops and no-till situations, we know it's what we have to do. So when we look at that, reducing that fallow, and I think Augustine's charts really show you, if you look around the edges, January, February, March to December, giving you an idea of how many days in a rotation, having less fallow, it's visual when you see that chart. And for those that are just trying to get their feet wet into the cover crop or wondering about it, that's the one advantage. And I think the other thing that Augustine brought up, having cover is important with cover crops, but as a producer, Brad, how many days do you think you saved on feeding cattle because you had cover crops?
Well, with my cow herd, I graze year round, and so basically it saved, from that instance, it saved 5 months. With my stalker program, from February to March last year, I ran out of grazing. So for those 120 head, we had to bale graze, and that cost us about $5,000. So I can plant a lot of cover crop seed for $5,000.
So, and that's one of the things that all of us here, whether you're the producer, the landowner, extension, other agency individuals, sometimes getting the buy-in for cover crops is really hard because of that cost. That's going to cost me so much an acre. So they don't take into account the money that they're saving by putting cattle out here that they're not having to feed, they're not having to grind hay, or they're not having to bring that in and find a source, because, you know, in some years we don't have that. So maybe penciling it out and looking to see if grazing those cover crops is beneficial. In some parts of the state, especially where our watershed is, I can pay for alternative water source, so that's why I asked Brad what his water source is. For us, on the back of that map, you'll see in Ellsworth County, there's little fingers. That's our targeted area. If you as a producer, landowner, tenant, own or operate land in that targeted area, you're eligible for that cost share to put cover crops out, to move cattle away from the creeks, to provide the alternative water. We'll also pay for alternative windbreak, so it doesn't have to be living. It can be panels. It can be a movable, portable windbreak that you move as you rotate animals through cover crops. So there's lots of those things, but the benefits of cover crops, many of you already know them. We're going to increase organic matter, we're going to increase carbon, we're going to reduce runoff, increase infiltration, and I agree with what Dale said. It would have been great if we would have had the same monitor across the road in a conventional field. And all of us understand, no-till doesn't necessarily work for everybody. Maybe it's the dynamics of the operation. Maybe there's not somebody coming back. Maybe you don't have the equipment, or maybe that's your retirement. We understand that, but we also hope that you'll look at this water quality benefit. So for our producers in the watershed, we work through the conservation districts in our CS office, and obviously look Dallas County, we were putting a tire tank in that day, and in Russell County we had 3.5 inches in less than 45 minutes, so we got to redo a tire tank. So I'm not getting lucky on this. I wish we would have brought some moisture for everybody, but it didn't happen. Basically for us, water quality, having some type of living root, some type of cover, I think you have to definitely look at the big picture. Yes, it's costing me on this side, but what is it going to save me on the other side? And with the availability, Brad, you might explain when you said you moved fence, when you were moving them, what type of fencing you're using, how you're making it work.
I'll go get some stuff.
Okay.
I'll be right back.
The technology now for paddock systems in a grazing cover crop is relatively easy. Some of those things are available through cost share through any of our agencies that help you with that. We do have staff that can help you with the cover crops, along with the offices, NRCS and Conservation Districts and Kansas State University, to help you figure out what the best mix for cover crops are, what might work. You don't necessarily have to start big. If you've got 20 or 30 acres, play with it. Let's see what we can do for you to make it work. Sometimes it's just trying to get your feet wet, get in the door. All of us understand if you're the tenant, getting some of the landlords to buy into this can be a challenge at times. But once you get some of it working, I think you'll be amazed at how much you're saving on having some type of root. And obviously for us, again, it's the water quality side, reducing that sediment, reducing that nitrogen and phosphorus. The reservoir was built with a 200 useful lifespan. We know there's at least 60 years off because of the sediment in the bottom of the reservoir. And it's been several years, it's probably been at least 10. At that point it was $5,500 per acre foot to dredge that soil out. So when you look at what the cost is, the state will tell you that it's cheaper to abandon all of that infrastructure at Canopolis and build a new reservoir, which seems silly, but because the watershed is so big, looking at these water quality issues, and I not only work on the ag side with producers and landowners, putting practices out on the ground, offering cost share, I also work with the cities. So I'm very fortunate that our city communities understand their contribution to these pollutant loadings coming in as well. So questions? Pam has all the information for cost share. We can pay for soil testing. We can pay to convert you from conventional till to minimum till to no-till. We can pay for the cover crops. We can pay for relocation of feeding sites, the fencing issues. So if you have questions, let us know, because that's what the benefits of the program are. The more we get in there, the greater we see on water quality improvement. So, Brad's got the fencing.
Hey, can I add real quick? I'm Pamela Hayes with the Conservation District in Ellsworth County, and that same area that's in her maps is also eligible for a Kansas Reservoir Protection Initiative, and that sign up is going on right now until the end of August, and we can pay $45 an acre for cover crops. Your first year, 30 your second, and 15 third. So I've had a couple people do that one, and it's so far been a pretty good program. But it's basically 1 mile to the Hill River and half mile in some of those in that area.
Those of you that are in that area, you should have gotten a postcard in the mail telling you that the cost share was available for the opportunity for you guys to get enrolled. So. Brad?
The fencing, well, when I fence this off with my stoppers, if it's early in the fall, I'll put all the way around the perimeter. We just have so many deer, and a lot of times one wire will break, and at least if there's one wire that stays. But like last winter, since we didn't get here until well, it was basically January, the cattle are by that time are pretty much bulletproof, and they just kind of know where the fence is. So I had one strand all the way around that was metal wire, and then I use this braided wire, which is actually, I don't know, it's poly is what the main wire is, but then it has like 11 strands of stainless steel on the inside, and that's where the electricity runs. They sell this as a miracle wire, but it's not. There's just too much resistance. After about 3/8 of a mile, it doesn't matter what your charger is, you just lose charge. So in my summer grazing, I have miles of electric fence, but I keep this down to 3/8 of a mile or less, and I have a lot fewer problems. But this is what I use on this. I'll go down to the creek, which is, that's a haul, but in the winter it's not usually a problem.
Yeah.
And then these are the posts, the step-in posts. I use two different kinds. Depending on soil conditions, one actually will go in better than the other. So that way I figure I'm only cussing half the posts every day instead of cussing every post. So, you know, when the ground is just a little froze, these go in better. When the ground's a lot froze, these I can hit these with a hammer. But they're designed to just be able to step in. And I like the hook to where I'll leave my fence hot and I'll just pick this post up. Like say if it's set here today and I want to go down there 40 feet, all I'll do is pick this up over my head and just walk, set it down, and go all the way down the line. Some people will have one line set and then they'll set the next day's fence to where all they have to do is roll this one up. But I have, all year long, I have so much electric fence up that that's just one less roll of wire I need to have. So that's why I just move them daily. That's pretty much it on the fence. How big did you say those stockers? They were about 500 pounds.
And Dale is going to start us off with comparing the soil structure between that field, the till field, and then a sample collected from the cover crop field out here. And so if you come around more to look at the...
Those of you that are not familiar with me, my name's Dale Yunker. I'm with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm actually part of the state soil science staff out of Salina, but I'm headquartered in Jetmore, Kansas. And I serve as the soil health specialist for NRCS. For the most part, the majority of my work is in the western part of the state, but I do venture out more towards the eastern part of the state, kind of depending on what's doing and where we're at and everything else. I've been with the agency for 33 years, been in this soil health position for the last 8 years, going on 9. So in that time, I've kind of really picked up and learned what, kind of look at some differences and figure out how things work. Along with my position with NRCS, myself and my two sons, we also farm in Ellis, Rush, predominantly in Ellis and Rush County, and then some outlying fields in Trego and Rooks County. And all those fields are in a no-till system where we, and in a pretty intensive rotation. We typically, we kind of like we're trying to grow something out there on every acre, the entire year. So we don't incorporate a livestock operation just because it's all farm jobs. Plus, we're a fair distance away from many of the fields we have, and then we're pretty scattered out from that standpoint too. And then the other issue is water availability in that area. You just, there's just not a lot of places. There's just not groundwater available, and you have to haul water, and then that takes some of the economics away from it. But our system, but we've been in a no-till system on some fields fields for over 20 years. We concentrate on cash crops, but if we do have a window to where we're not getting a cash crop in because maybe it's getting too late to plant a crop or whatever, we'll try to throw in a cover crop. Typically they're pretty simple cover crops, a lot of times single species like a triticale after fall harvest, after milo or beans, and then we'll come back in and plant a bean or a milo after that in the spring. But if we kind of take a look, and you can just visually, you can kind of, and here we can't see that much because we have growing milo out there. If you look at the field across the road, I mean, you can see where it's ready. It must have had a little bit of a shower or something since they had tilled that, and it already has sealed over. I mean, and what's happened basically is, when we don't have good stable aggregates, and Augustine was talking about aggregate stability and good stable aggregates, we lose our soil porosity, or we lose those pore spaces in the soil. And when we're talking about aggregates, we're talking about individual particles of sand, silt, and clay that are bound together by what I call biological glues. And these biological glues are produced by biology in the soil, the mycorrhiza fungi, the bacteria, and everything else that's in the soil, along with some root exudates that are also part of that biological glue. And so, when we get down to the individual particles of soil, then we lose those pore spaces. And the only way we can gain those pore spaces or maintain those pore spaces is by a living plant using sunlight as its energy source, and along with carbon dioxide and nutrients and water, and turn that into a carbon. Turn that into a carbon base in the soil that soil biology can utilize, and in return, help us with soil organic carbon, and also provide those glues that hold those individual soil particles together. It's pretty difficult to kind of see, but because it's awful dry out there, we haven't had a rain for a bit, you can tell that. But this is from the milo field here, and if we look at it, we still have a little platiness on the surface, but we're seeing some macropores in there, meaning that we got some activity going on in there, and then also again, when we're talking about aggregates, a lot of times, we're talking about micro aggregates that you really can't even see unless you get it under a microscope. But when you have that soil porosity, then when you get that 2.5–3 inch rain, you can take it in. This here, and I kind of already destroyed the soil surface, but you can see the difference. If you can see the difference in the soil structure here. For the most part, we're down to the individual soil particles here. And so again, when we do get that rain, we get what we're seeing there. It's just it seals over, and and after you till it again, there's some air spaces and stuff like that, but and it may take a ½ inch of rain before it begins to seal over, but then after that, it's gonna that water's gonna go somewhere. It's either gonna go, like you said earlier, down to the east into the into the low area, or it's going to evaporate off the soil surface. And when we have a 140 degree day with 20-mile-an-hour winds, there's a lot of moisture going up out into and it's evaporating off that field right now. It's just going to continue to migrate to the surface, and it's just going to go up into the atmosphere. So, but it's that aggregate stability, and it's having follow systems. I mean, quite honestly, and as we go further west, we've had a lot of producers attempt these no-till follow systems, like in a wheat sorghum follow rotation. And you know, at some point they're going to be destined to fail because number one, you know, weeds start kicking their ass because they can't take care. You know, they just can't maintain that follow field. You know, without herbicide-resistant weeds and other issues coming up. And the other thing is we're really not gaining a lot because we're not feeding that biology in the soil, and it's all, you know, it all revolves around the biology in the soil. And I know that at times it was for me. Sometimes that's a little hard to wrap your head around about, you know, the importance of that. But it really is. I mean, that's where the rubber meets. The rubber meets the road is that soil biology, trying to maintain that, and then working with the environment you have to be able to do that. So, Augustine, I think that's somebody asked questions. That's all I have.
Any questions about that? So, like Dale mentioned, if you have a very good soil structure with here you are seeing some structure with the soil here.